I live in North Hollywood, California. My brother and I live together in a nice, quiet neighborhood where not even car break-ins happen. Trust me, in Northern Hollywood, there aren't many neighborhoods like that. A few years ago, my next-door neighbor Jillian adopted a dog to keep her older dog company while she was at work. I work from home myself, so she would often ask me to let her dogs out around lunchtime, and sometimes once more around 4 p.m. if she would be working late that day. One day, Jillian called me and said she had a meeting after work. She asked if I could go over twice that day, and I said that was perfectly fine. I went at around 12 p.m. the first time. I should explain the basic layout of Jillian's house. As you walk through the front door, it's a pretty straight shot from the door through the living room and dining room to get to the back door. Obviously, that leads to the backyard. The bedrooms and bathroom are on the left side of the house, and the kitchen is on the right side. Jillian likes to close all the doors before leaving, so only the dining room and living room are open for the dogs to hang out in. As I made my way through this time, I noticed that all the doors were closed as usual. I greeted the dogs and took them into the backyard to do their business and run around a little. While we were outside, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere. I started to feel very uneasy. I heard the dogs go back inside. As calmly as I could, I made sure everything was locked up. Then I walked home. At around 4 p.m., I started back over for my second visit. As I approached the front door and put the key in, I had this sinking feeling in the middle of my chest. I shrugged it off and went inside so I could take care of the dogs. As I walked over to them, I noticed that one of the bedroom doors was now wide open. I let the dogs out and sort of thought back to my first visit. I was fairly certain that all the doors had been closed. I thought to myself that maybe Jillian had forgotten something and come back to the house briefly while I was away. Probably just forgot to tell me. I pulled out my phone and called her up real quick. "Hey, did you come back home earlier? I'm here to let the dogs out and I saw your bedroom door was open." What she said next chilled me to the bone. "No, I'm just getting in my car to head home now. Why?" I wanted to run and scream, but I decided to act as normal as possible. I didn't know if whoever had opened that bedroom door was still lurking around the property. I told Jillian I was calling the cops and hung up the phone. I let the dogs into the backyard, then went back inside. I announced loudly and calmly as I could, "Bye guys, see you tomorrow." I exited the house and dialed 911. I heard Jillian's front door open suddenly, and a tall, thin man emerged from the doorway. He began to sprint towards me. I ran as fast as I could towards my home. I opened the door, which was not locked, and slammed the door behind me. I locked the man out, and that's when I heard him call from the other side. "I'm coming for you." Before I could hit the call button, I heard a window break in the kitchen. I realized my brother was not home, and I had to fend for myself. I ran into my brother's room and went to his closet. I found the baseball bat he kept hidden away. I could now hear the man walking around my house, searching for me. He came into my brother's room and looked under the bed. I stood up from my place in the closet and prepared for him to find me. I was sobbing as quietly as I could and praying I would get a swing in before he got to me. He stood up and made his way over to the closet. He opened the door, and I swung at him right away. I smacked him hard in the chest, and he fell down to the ground. He managed to get right back up and knocked the bat out of my hands. He then shoved me to the ground and started dragging me out of the room. In the hallway, we found my brother standing there with a knife. Turns out he had come home after realizing he'd forgotten his wallet. He rushed the man and stabbed him in the shoulder. The intruder moaned as he fell to the floor, and my brother kicked him in the face over and over. He told me to call the cops. Just then, I heard sirens outside. Jillian had already called the cops after we hung up. She knew it was her crazy ex-husband who had broken into her house, and the cops dragged the man out of my home. He later confessed that he had planned on killing Jillian. When he saw me there, he decided to kill me and anyone in my house as well. He's not well in the head, if you catch my drift. I hate to think of what would have happened to me if my brother hadn't forgotten his wallet. This happened when I was 15. My dad and I were driving my sister from San Diego to Austin, Texas, where she would start her new job. She had lived in Guam for a year, and she couldn't afford to ship her car all the way to Texas, only to California. My dad and I loaded up her car with things she'd need and began the drive all the way to the Lone Star State. We had been going for a few hours now and decided to stop in El Centro to get some gas and use the bathroom. I didn't have to go myself, so I volunteered to pump the gas. As my dad and sister went inside, there were a few other cars at the pumps and in the parking lot. There was a man, about 5'10" and average sized. I noticed he was at the pump adjacent to ours. As soon as I went to throw some trash away, he began giving me this weird look of sheer malice and hate. Being the unathletic turd I was highly intimidated. My father walked out of the store and told me he'd bought $35 worth of gas. He didn't seem to notice the strange man glaring at me as he climbed into the driver's seat. He looked down at his phone, and I began pumping the gas and tried to make the best of the situation. My sister walked out of the store soon after. I averted my eyes to look at her. At that point, I saw out of my peripheral vision the man reaching into his pocket and producing a knife. He then harshly whispered to me to get into his car, or else he was going to stab me. I went into full defense mode. I shoved the guy as hard as I could and knocked him off balance. I guess I'd taken him by surprise. He hit the gas hose that connected to his car, knocking it off and spraying him in gasoline as he fell backward. I hung up my own gas hose and yelled at my sister to get into the car and for my dad to fire it up. We jumped in the car together. I think my dad had seen the knife because he floored it the hell out of there. I saw the guy jump into his white Chevy and turn it on. But by that time, we were already out of the station and heading back to the interstate. I told them what happened, and my dad drove even faster to get back to the interstate. I looked out the back window and saw that same white Chevy weaving in between traffic, seemingly chasing after us. He pulled up right next to us, and that's when I noticed there was someone else in the passenger seat. And the passenger rolled down his window and pointed a handgun at us, screaming to pull over. Instead, my dad hit the gas, bringing us up to almost 100 miles per hour. The Chevy was still next to us. Suddenly, my dad shouted at me and my sister to get down and brace ourselves. The Chevy abruptly swerved and sideswiped us, but the collision caused them to lose focus, sending them into the far lane, where they hit the back of a semi going at least 90 miles an hour. As we sped away, we saw their whole front end had caved in completely, and they were forced to pull over. We got off the next exit and went to a police station. We reported the incident. After about an hour, they told us they'd found the broken down Chevy. Both the assailants had left it behind and fled on foot. They fled before the truck driver could even get out of his rig, apparently. When I described the appearance of the guy, the police knew he was a serial offender. There were reports of him luring children into his car all across the Southwest and bringing them back to Mexico. He was wanted on several counts of kidnapping. After a few days, we were able to continue our move to Texas, and the rest of the trip went off without much of a hitch. I'm a 22-year-old female from South Texas. The town where I live in is quite small and still growing. Due to the lack of entertainment there, we often go to Houston or one of the other big cities nearby. Given this situation, my family decided to surprise me with tickets to a concert to one of my favorite artists. I would be joined by my sister. I was quite excited and thought it would be a really good time. It was a 3-hour drive or so there and back. We had a wedding to go to the next day, so we decided to save some time and take some back roads to get there faster. I wish we could have stayed at the hotel. After the amazing concert, we decided to get some Taco Bell and start heading back. Mind you, this was around 11:30 p.m. or so. Everything was going perfectly fine until the low tire pressure signal came on. My sister pulled over and got out of the car to check on things. I could hear her cursing. The tire was not only low on pressure, but completely deflated. My sister and I were both raised to be independent. You can always save a few extra bucks by doing things yourself. It goes without saying that we both knew how to change a tire. While we were in the process, a man suddenly emerged from the nearby tree line. He was about 6 foot tall, but what really caught my eye was how well dressed he was. He wore a suit and had this creepy smile. He walked up to us and offered to help, but we kindly declined. After that, he just kind of stood there and continued to stare at us. We made up a white lie and said our parents were already on the way and they would be there any moment to help us out. We told the man this in hopes that he would leave now. Eventually, he did do so. He just turned around and walked back into the tree line without saying another word. I thought it was quite weird how he'd just randomly come out of the forest at the perfect time. Just when we thought it was over, though, the man came back out, except this time there was a knife in his hand, and he was donning a black mask over his face. I started to freak out. He ran up to our car and sunk his knife into the rear passenger side tire. Me and my sister scrambled back into the vehicle through the driver's side doors and locked it just in time. And that's when a white truck pulled up behind us. We thought it was someone coming to help us, but that's when we saw 3 more men wearing black masks exit the vehicle and surround our car. And the 3 men started banging on the windows, while the guy with the suit got on top of the hood and began to drag his knife across the windshield, making this awful screeching sound. At that point, we had called the cops, but there was no sign of them showing up anytime soon. One of the men banged on the window so hard I thought they were going to break, and that's when the man in the suit jumped down off the hood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. I thought we were dead in that instant, and I began to pray. My sister started screaming hysterically. The guy walked up to the rear passenger side window and pointed his gun. He fired a shot inside, sending shards of glass all over the back seat. The first shot didn't fully break the window, so he pulled the trigger again. My heart had never raced so fast in my life. The masked man used his gun to move away some of the remaining glass and unlock the back door. During all this commotion, I had retrieved my pepper spray from my travel bag. The man made his way inside the car, and in that moment I turned around and emptied the entire bottle right into his face. The man immediately put his free hand over his eyes and began to scream. He pointed the gun at my sister. In that moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like the entire world was frozen still. For whatever reason, the man didn't pull the trigger. That's when I heard the fast-approaching police sirens. The men fled and jumped back into their truck within seconds. We saw their taillights disappearing into the night. The police arrived too late. We gave our report and I tried my best to give a description, but most of what came out of my mouth was nonsense. I was obviously pretty shaken up over what happened. The police combed the area. It turned out we were at the wrong place at the wrong time. These men had set up nails on the road and were just waiting for their next victims. They were possibly human traffickers. The police put out an APB on the truck, but as far as I know, they never found the men responsible. Always be careful when you're driving on the back roads of Texas. These men could still be out there, looking for their next victims. Always be sure to bring something to protect yourself with. It just might save your life. Hello everyone, my name is Luke. I'm French and I'm 26 years old. I currently live in Australia since May of 2019. I met my girlfriend Mina, who is of Japanese origin, about 1 month after arriving in Australia. We met on a strawberry farm where we both worked. We worked on it for several months until the health crisis impacted the planet. So, job on the farm was over, and we had to find something else. At that moment, the two choices available to us were go back home and separate, very hard for both of us, or stick together and try to get through this ordeal. Spoiler alert, we chose the second option. We decided to leave this seasonal job in the countryside and go to the city together to try and find new jobs. Bingo. Good news for me, an employer wanted to hire me to work for a local Australian football team. We'll call this employer Kathy. Kathy explained to me that I could work for managing the football team, but that currently, because of the health crisis, we'd have to wait until obligatory confinement periods passed and the football season resumed. I explained that I did like the job, but it would be quite hard for Mina and I to remain unemployed during that entire confinement period. We had to pay rent, food, and all that stuff still. Luckily, Kathy had a heart as big as the entirety of Australia. Sensitive to our situation, she explained that she had a solution for both of us. She owned a holiday home several kilometers from Brisbane, which belonged to her father, who was now in a retirement home. We could stay there for free during the period we couldn't work. At the time, I didn't really believe it. I told myself something fishy was clearly going on, but faced with this situation, I had no choice but to accept. It was the only real solution for us. We accepted the proposal together and moved into this house a few days later. We played Animal Crossing, Splatoon, Mortal Kombat, and did many other things together during this confinement period. Everything was going pretty well. We did feel a little bit lonely though. The house was very isolated in the countryside. Apart from that, everything seemed perfectly fine. We had a garden, a kitchen, basically everything for free. We really couldn't complain or be choosers here. I would like to reiterate once again that this house was in the middle of nowhere. We had just a single neighbor, John, who took care of his horses and whom I got along well with, but he rarely stopped by to visit the place. He was basically the only guy around. Other details which will be important. In this house, there's a main entrance door with a large blurred window, so you can distinguish things through it. There's another wooden door behind the house which opens onto a veranda connected to the home. The house is single-story, so there are no floors, and there are no curtains on the windows except in the bedroom. 3 or 4 weeks after moving in, Kathy called me to tell me some good news. I could finally go to work. The first day of work, everything was like clockwork. I loved what I was doing, and it was a very good working atmosphere. The only problem was, we were still staying in Kathy's father's house, which was several kilometers away, and I didn't have a car. It took an hour and a few separate train rides to get there, the same coming back as well. Like I said before though, I couldn't really complain. Mina was still looking for work. She hadn't been as lucky as me, so she was mostly stuck at home while I was working. The second day of work at 5 p.m., I was getting ready to end my day when I received a surprise call from Mina. She was whispering, and her voice was trembling. I knew immediately that something was wrong. I'm going to switch to her point of view so you get as much detail as possible. I was quietly playing Animal Crossing on the sofa when I saw a silhouette through the blurred window of the main entrance door. It was not the right shape for it to be Luke or even John, and I understood that very quickly. I stared at this figure, who was now motionless in the front door. That's when I tried to get up and slowly move away. At this point, the individual outside started frantically banging. My heart started racing, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to be as discreet as possible, so the individual would think no one was home or would open the door for them. I finally decided to hide in the bedroom closet because it's the only room where you couldn't see what was happening from the outside. Huddling between the hangers and our clothes, I was praying for the person outside to just go away. At that point, I remembered there was a second door behind the home that was free to access. I couldn't remember if it had been locked or not. Feeling a surge of courage, I decided to rush through the house in order to reach this door. During this race, I saw the individual passing in front of one of the kitchen windows. The conclusion? This man was also going around back to check if the door was open. Panicked but already in the race, I decided to run to the end and close the door before the man tried to open it. When I finally pushed the latch, I heard the individual trying to push open the door. Switching back to my perspective, completely frightened, she went back to hide in the cupboard, and that's when she called me. I had a little bit of trouble understanding what she was trying to say to me on the phone, since her voice was trembling and she was so panicked. I tried to calm her down so I could get more clear information on what was happening. After a minute where I asked her to focus on breathing and listen to me, she managed to calmly describe to me the events occurring. Being next to Kathy, I asked her if anyone was supposed to pay a visit to the house or something. No one was supposed to come or even know that the house was being inhabited. I knew I had to get home as quickly as possible and ensure Mina was not in any danger. I asked her to stay in the cupboard and call the police and call me back directly afterwards. I was going to rush home. She decided to stay on the phone with me. Not the best solution, I admit. She should have called the police, but she was in a total state of stress and panic, and I guess having me on the phone reassured her. I ordered an Uber and told him to go as fast as possible. She explained to me that she no longer heard anything outside, no one knocking at the door or lingering around the house. I advised her to stay in hiding. She decided to take a peek outside the cupboard, though, and confirmed to me a few minutes later that the silhouette was no longer visible behind the door, and no one seemed to be around the house. I arrived at 5:45 p.m. I rushed over to Mina and wrapped her up in a big hug. I explained to her that now that I was here, there was nothing to fear anymore. At 6 p.m., it started to get completely dark. I checked the locks and tried to get this off our minds by playing games and watching anime together. That was a mistake, though. In my relief at finding her safe with no further problems, I omitted the detail of greatest importance. Check around the house, you idiot. Why didn't you check the house first? It was now time to go to bed. At 1 a.m., the neighbor's horses woke me up. I could hear the hooves. Mina, still not really asleep, asked me what the noise was. I told her it was just the neighbor's horses. At 3 a.m., there was a series of sudden frantic knocks on the back door. It was super strong, like they were trying to break it down. I can tell you, I discovered what adrenaline was at that moment. I was sure it was the same guy as earlier, and he had one intention all along, to get into this house. Mina was screaming. I started to shake all over. I had this feeling of being paralyzed while still expending a ton of energy. It's very strange to explain. Eventually, I got out of bed, planning to barricade the back door and call the police. As I left the room, though, I heard a dull metallic noise. He had opened the back door and was on the veranda. There was only one last door with a poor wooden wedge under the small space at the bottom that separated us. At this moment, it was certain he was going to get in. I'm not really the type to fight, and I'm not worth much in a fight anyway, but I had no choice. I grabbed the biggest knife I had and placed myself in an angle in which I had the best chance of taking him by surprise. I was ready to defend myself with a knife if need be, to defend Mina, who was paralyzed in fear on the bed. Honestly, I could already see myself explaining to the courts why I'd stabbed a guy. I was scared, no doubt, but at the same time, hearing Mina's screams filled me with determination. She threw me the phone and told me to call the police. I did so, still in the same position and ready to defend myself. The phone call must have lasted 40 seconds. The policeman on the phone understood straight away that this was a serious situation. He asked me for the address and said they were on the way immediately. At this moment, I found myself a little more relieved while remaining on lookout. This is where the individual began to mumble incomprehensible stuff that didn't really assure me. From the noise he was making, he was either a guy who was heavily drunk, on drugs, or mentally ill. He must have figured I'd called the cops, but he was still reaching for the handle and trying to get inside. At 3:10, the cops finally arrived, 4 officers and 1 dog. As I saw them approaching, I heard noises behind the door. The individual seemed to get scared and give up. I heard the dog barking, the policeman shouting, and the man moaning. Finally, it was finished. The individual was neutralized and taken away in the police car. The officers stayed with us to talk to us and get our version of the events that happened, to find out if we wanted to file charges or not. The officer told us there was a chance this man was a patient at a rehab center nearby. He also told us he wasn't sure of anything at the time, and they would have to verify his identity. Ultimately, we never heard back from the guy or the police, though. After that night, I admit we had a lot of trouble sleeping. I contacted Kathy to explain to her what happened to us. She was shocked and felt somewhat responsible as well. Unfortunately, there are no real answers as to who the guy was, nor what he wanted. I even ended up wondering if maybe this was someone who was actually in distress and went about things very poorly, in need of help. I guess we'll never really know. So yeah, I guess the lesson is Australia is great. This happened to me and a friend of mine a couple years back at our local church. For the sake of this story, my name will be Jamie, and we'll call my friend Mark. We were pretty young back then. I was 13 and Mark was only 12. This church is located in San Antonio, Texas. It also happens to be one of the oldest churches in the area. This all began at around noon sometime. We ended up hanging around church after Mass, waiting for our monthly youth meeting to begin. We still had 2 hours to kill, so we headed for a trail that went through the churchyard and continued past the grounds into a nearby preservation. This trail was commonly used by cyclists, but we like to walk these trails just to kill some time. Also, to feel a little bit rebellious in our young minds. As we walked by this bench that was no more than a minute into the trail, my friend noticed something sitting on it. There was this dirty pillow, and there was no one nearby. "I dare you to take a nap and wait till someone wakes you up," Mark said jokingly. I wisely declined that offer. God knows where that musty pillow must have been. We assumed it must belong to one of the many homeless people we'd seen around town. It would also be quite rude to use someone else's things without their permission. Eventually, we got done with all our stuff and started to head back to Mark's house. His dad only lived about 7 minutes away, and we'd usually walk there from church on the nights where I would be staying with Mark. This was one of the few days I actually got to spend the night at Mark's house. Mark's dad had to work early the next morning, and he was asleep by 10 p.m. By midnight, me and Mark were still up, trying to figure out what we should do. "Bro, we gotta get out of here. Don't you want to do something else besides playing video games all night?" I admitted that the games were getting kind of boring, but there was really nothing else to do. "Well, what else did you have in mind?" I asked him. "Let's head back to that trail. We'll bring some flashlights and a pocket knife for protection." That sounded like a good idea to me. I was eager to do something different, so I agreed to go. Now, we went out at night more often than you might probably think, but we'd never been on the trail this late at night. We put on some sweaters, grabbed some of his dad's pocket knives and some flashlights before heading off to explore. As we walked down the dimly lit road, there was this sensation that something was not quite right settling in the pit of my stomach. I ignored that feeling and told myself I was just being paranoid. As we approached the trail's opening, Mark shined his light through the trees. There were crickets chirping, along with the wind rustling the leaves. After about a minute or so after entering the trail, I thought I could hear some footsteps behind us. They seemed to slowly die down as we continued on. Since this trail was about 3/4 of a mile long, it took a little while for us to reach the church grounds. While passing by the bench we encountered earlier that day, we discovered the dirty old pillow was still there. Mark said he could actually take a nap now if he wanted. I shrugged it off and told him, let's just go to the end so we can turn around and go home. This place is kind of giving me the creeps. By the time we got to the end, I had forgotten all about those faint footsteps I'd heard earlier. We turned around and started to head back the way we came. At this point, we were a ways away from the bench, but still close enough to see it. We stopped dead in our tracks as we were startled by the sound of footsteps running. "What the hell was that?" I said under my breath. Before I could figure out what to do, I noticed that pillow was now missing from the bench. I pointed it out to Mark, who was scanning the surrounding area with his flashlight. He pointed it at the bench area. As he did, we both noticed something standing behind a tree, a pair of eyes staring daggers at us. Mark quickly moved the light away and seemed to have the same idea I did. We should act like we hadn't seen anything and go home the other way. I nodded and followed his lead. As we turned around, though, we heard the sound of someone sprinting full speed right for us. Mark took off and I quickly followed behind him. The assailant was much faster than us and closing in quickly. I grabbed Mark and pulled him off to the side after switching his light off. I told him in a quiet voice that we should hide in the brush and wait for the man to pass, then run back. We heard the distinct sound of heavy breathing nearby and saw a large, dark figure through the bushes. When we were sure the figure had made its way past us, we made a break for Mark's house. We ran out of the trail and kept going. When we arrived at his home, we were out of breath and covered in sweat. To this day, we don't know who that was waiting for us behind the tree, nor do we know exactly what he was planning on doing if he'd managed to catch up to us. A couple of years ago, my husband and I took a trip to Yosemite. We stayed outside the park in El Portal. One evening, while we were driving back from the valley, I noticed that the headlights caught what appeared to be someone lying down on the side of the road, both feet pointed out towards the street. I told my husband there was a person laying in the pitch black on the side of the highway. He knows I love true crime and was absolutely certain what I had seen were trash bags. I was so certain, though, I just kept saying, "No, I saw a body. I know that was a person." We made our way back to the hotel, and as we were about to park, my husband looked over at me. "You're really sure about this, aren't you? You want to go back and look?" I was desperate. As we drove by the same area again, I saw the feet clearly. I had my husband turn the car back around and yelled at him to stop the vehicle. He rolled down his window and called out, "Are you okay?" There was no answer. One more time, even louder. Suddenly, a woman dressed in all black sat up. She was wearing a nice down jacket, black pants, had her purse and 3 water bottles. Her makeup was done very nicely, and she seemed very sweet. I could tell my husband was absolutely shocked. I asked her where she was headed. She said she was trying to get to the Chevron station up the road, and that her mom was going to meet her there to pick her up. This woman looked to be in her late 40s, mind you. I knew something weird was going on. From where we found her, the Chevron station was another 7 miles away. She said that in her mind she thought it was only a mile from her hotel, and that she'd be able to walk that distance. We offered her a ride and she climbed into the back seat. Not before I grabbed a thick scarf to wrap around my neck and my pepper spray. As we drove, we tried to ask her questions, just general chit-chat, you know. I asked her why she was laying on the side of the road in the pitch black. She said she'd gotten tired while walking and had to lay down and give up. It was winter and she had no hat or gloves either. I could tell this woman looked very fragile. Once we arrived at the Chevron station, she thanked us, got out of the car and sat down on a bench in front of the closed Chevron station store. We offered to stay with her until her mother arrived, but she insisted she'd be fine. I reminded her there was no cell reception in the area and triple-checked that she didn't want us to wait with her. We drove back to our hotel and noticed there were now 2 police cars in the parking lot. They had not been there the first time we arrived back that evening. I told my husband I knew they had to be there for that woman for whatever reason. I calmly walked over to one of the cars and asked if they were looking for a missing woman. The officer told me they were and asked if I'd seen her. I explained the situation and that I felt like the woman had something very bad happen to her. He thanked us for picking her up and giving her a ride. He couldn't tell me what happened, but thought leaving her and going somewhere else was a smart choice. I asked that he go check on her at the Chevron station, just to make sure she was okay. I was now realizing that whatever had occurred must have been at the same hotel we were staying at. That evening, I looked up a local police log and found a serious domestic violence dispute had broken out at the hotel. The woman had been beaten severely and was so terrified that she was willing to walk in the dark without a flashlight just to get away. It's my guess that after walking a mile from the hotel, she was in so much pain that she needed to lay down. I got the distinct feeling she thought she might actually die there. She couldn't go back to the hotel because she'd already escaped and gone to the front desk to call her mom. Her husband knew she'd be there and would have come after her. The front desk called the police for her while she escaped. It's my understanding that the man who injured her was her husband and was soon arrested. I was always worried about her and wondered whether she managed to escape. Did her mom pick her up in the end? Did she get home safe? Now my husband always listens whenever I tell him I see a body on the side of the road. When I was 12 to 13 years old, I was waiting for my friends at the entrance to a large park in my city. While I was waiting, a van pulled up next to me, and the man inside rolled down his window. "Hey there, kid, what are you up to?" I replied I was waiting for my friends. I paced back and forth, slightly away from the van with each step. "Where they coming from?" he asked. I answered, "From the metro." "Hop in, I'll give you a lift there." At this point, I knew this guy was a creeper. I told him no thanks and began to walk away. He insisted I accept his lift. I left the park entrance. He pulled into the parking lot, did a U-turn, and drove out of the park along the road I was walking on. Having noticed what he was doing early on, I walked really fast to a hole in the fence of the park and climbed in. I guess he realized from that point he'd have to do an 8 to 10 minute drive to get back to the area I was, and he gave up and left. I met up with my friends a bit later and told them the story as well,